This is Chris Savage from Ariel Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session tonight, The Road Ahead. I pray that this will be of benefit to you and it will help you in growing in the grace and knowledge of your Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. Thank you. Tonight we're going to have a title that's The Road Ahead, simply because there's a lot of things being said and done about on the world stage. I mean, this is a historic period of time. Never before has the world been locked down like we have been. And it just shows you how easy it is to lock the world down. And so I thought, you hear things being bandied about like, one world system and one world government. And, it's becoming more and more the talk in the realms of the super rich. So I thought we'll just have a look at some stuff tonight so we can get a bit of a grasp of what's coming up for us. So it's a very brief prophetic overview of what is to come. So we're gonna just have a look at a couple of things here. Primarily, we're gonna look at Daniel, Daniel chapter 2 and Daniel chapter 7. And we saw in Daniel, or we see in Daniel, that Nebuchadnezzar had a dream and Daniel had to tell him what the dream was. And we see this in Daniel chapter 2, verses 31 to 35. And Daniel says, "You, O king, saw and behold a great image. This image which was mighty and whose brightness was excellent stood before you. And the aspect thereof was terrible. As for this image, its head was of fine gold, its breast and its arms of silver, its belly and its thighs of brass, its legs of iron, its feet part iron and part of clay. And you saw till that a stone was cut without hands, which smote the image upon its feet that were of iron and clay, and it broke them in pieces. Then was the iron, the clay, the brass, the silver, and the gold broken in pieces together and became like the chaff of the summer threshing floors. And the wind carried them away, so that no place was found for them. And the stone that smote the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth." So what we see in this image that Daniel tells Nebuchadnezzar his dream was, this image is described as having a head of gold, breast and arms were composed of silver, the belly and thighs of brass, legs of iron, and its feet were clay, and part iron. And this image is destroyed by a stone, and the stone, it smites the image on its feet. And then with the image destroyed, the stone becomes a great mountain that fills the entire earth. And this stone, it emphasized, was cut without hands, meaning that it has a divine origin. And we do know from the scriptures that anytime the word stone is used, or rock, it's always speaking about Jesus. Now, moving into Daniel chapter 7, verses 2 to 3, this is a vision that Daniel has now. So the first one was Nebuchadnezzar's dream, and he dreamt this dream, and he didn't know what it was, so Daniel had to explain the dream to him. And now in Daniel chapter 7, Daniel himself gets some visions. Daniel spake, this is chapter 7, verses 2 to 3. Daniel spake and said, "I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the four winds of heaven break forth upon the great sea. And four great beasts came up from the sea, diverse one from another." So Daniel sees a vision of the great sea, and the great sea in the Bible is the Mediterranean Sea, and that is representing the Gentile world. And we do see that in Isaiah 17, verses 12 to 13, for instance. Isaiah 17, 12 to 13, Matthew 13, verses 47 to 50, Revelation chapter 13, 1, Revelation 17, 1, and verse 15. So this great sea is troubled by the four winds. The number is the same as the Gentile empires, but the winds themselves points to God's sovereignty and God's providence. And suddenly what we see here is that these four beasts arise from this sea. Each one of them was different to the other. So all four are Gentile, and all four arise out of the Great Sea or the Mediterranean Sea. And then we have the first beast. It's eagle-winged and lion-like, and that represents the Babylonian Empire. We know that from history books and history. The second beast is bear-like, and that represents the Medo-Persian Empire. The third beast is leopard-like, and that represents the Hellenistic Empire under Alexander the Great. Now, that was his first vision. And he has another vision in verses 7 to 8 of Daniel 7. And this describes the fourth beast. Now, this beast, he can't describe it. The others are given animal-like descriptions, but no description is given for this fourth beast. It's described as being diverse. It's completely different from all the others. And this fourth beast completely subdues, and it breaks in pieces all that precedes it. So it breaks in pieces the empires that preceded it. And this fourth empire, it appears as far more ferocious than the previous three empires. And in Daniel 7, verse 23, he gives us some more information. This is 23. Thus he said, the fourth beast shall be a fourth kingdom upon earth, which shall be diverse from all the kingdoms, and shall devour the whole earth, and shall tread it down and break it in pieces. So, sometime in the future, this fourth beast will devour the whole earth. It will become a one world government system, and it devours the entire world. So this is a very brief study tonight. So if we bang together Daniel chapter 2 and Daniel chapter 7, we'll get this combination here. This combination shows the four empires, and it shows three stages of the fourth empire, and two of which are mentioned by Daniel 7. And Daniel 7 mentions 4 stages of the fourth empire, and Daniel 2 mentions 2 stages of the fourth empire. So you bang them together, and what we get is this. And this is pretty historically, you can see it. So the first empire was the Babylonian Empire. We know that from history. Then there was the Medo-Persian Empire. Then there was the Hellenistic Empire, and we know from Daniel that the Hellenistic Empire separated. Once Alexander the Great died, his 4 generals took over. So that's why you have the 4 division stage. Then we have the fourth empire. And the fourth empire goes through 5 stages. We have the united stage. We have the 2 division stage. We have the one world government stage. We have the 10 division stage, and then we have the Antichrist stage. And then the final empire is not Gentile, it's actually Jewish, and that's the Messianic kingdom. So what Daniel shows us is that the world system is going to be governed by 4 Gentile empires up until the time of the return of Christ, when the Messianic kingdom is now set up. And so we see in the, remembering the image that Nebuchadnezzar saw, it had 2 legs. So we start off with the united stage, and it goes into a 2 division stage, one world government stage, 10 division stage. So if you think about it, his image, you had, the 2 legs, then it goes into a one world government system, and it goes into the 10 toes, where we have the 10 division stage. And then the final stage will be the Antichrist stage. Okay, so we have Babylon, Medo-Persia, the Greek Hellenistic Empire, all historic. Then we have this fourth empire, which Daniel couldn't give an appearance to, but what we do know is that it was completely different to all the other empires. In actual fact, it was imperialistic. And in the various stages that this fourth empire goes through, the first stage was the united stage, and that was under Rome, the Roman Empire, because the Roman Empire knocked off the Greek Empire. and they took over. That's historic. Currently today, you and I, we're in this divided stage, the two legs of Nebuchadnezzar's image. And what we're in today is an east-west balance of power. We have the Western democracies and the Eastern Soviet bloc of countries, sort of thing. And the near future is going to be the one world government. So, even though people in power are talking about it, I've been talking about it for a while, but it's becoming more and more prevalent now. So we can expect, quite possibly within our lifetime, in fact, you younger folk, within your lifetime, we'll see this one world government. In fact, I think I'll even see this one world government system. So this is the near future. So we're going to look at this fourth empire, which is what we call the empire of imperialism. Why do we call it imperialism? Simply because under the previous three empires, whenever they took over, this is primarily Israel, whenever they took over Israel, they always had either Jewish kings or the high priest running the country. But when Rome took over, they wouldn't have a bar of that. They put in people like Pontius Pilate, Felix, and Festus. And what they did was they simply crushed the opposition. So first three empires are historic. Fourth empire, we're part of that today. And Daniel describes this fourth empire in Daniel 2, Daniel 7, Daniel 9, and Daniel 11. And it goes through 5 different stages. The Roman Empire is simply the first stage, because Rome can't be viewed as the entire fourth empire, because Italy is, to put it today. So what made the fourth empire, beginning with Rome, different? Because the type of government that it had was a government of imperialism. And so what we see is Rome developed this system of imperialism. And so that's why we call it the fourth empire of imperialism. Okay, so both Daniel passages, Daniel chapter 2, Daniel chapter 7, make it very clear that the fourth Gentile empire begins with the end of the third, which is the Greek or Hellenistic empire, and it continues right down until Messiah comes. So we're in the fourth empire today. We're in this stage where it's the divided stage, east-west balance of power stage. Now, first stage, United States, Roman Empire, and then it continues on. People think, oh, well, the old Roman Empire is going to come back to life again, and that's what we're going to be looking at in the future. Well, it's not. The Bible doesn't give that option. It doesn't say anything about that. What we do know is that it's more consistent to simply follow through the 5 stages that Daniel gives us. So we have the Roman Empire being the first stage, which was the united stage. It was united under the Roman Empire. And it lasted from 63 BC to 364 AD. Neither Daniel 2 or Daniel 7 allows for a revival of the old Roman Empire. It doesn't give us that option. Just a little bit of quick history here. The 2 division stage, which is where we are today, it began in AD 364 when an emperor called Valentinian, he divided the Roman Empire into an east-west division. And from that point on, the empire of imperialism was divided into an east-west balance of power. And since then, what do we see? It began in 364 AD with the Western Roman Empire, where was that headquartered? In Rome. And then we had the Eastern Roman Empire in a place called Constantinople. And so we had the original east-west axis. These 2 cities control the balance of power. Constantinople in the east, Rome in the west. Okay. And since then, the balance of power have shifted, but it still is an east-west balance of power. And so today, we have like the US and Britain and the Western democracies in one block, and then we have the Eastern Baltic states, Soviet bloc of countries in another block. And China is rising up there too. So the Eastern division of power remained in that place called Constantinople until 1453, when the Turks invaded. And Constantinople fell, and then the guys, the leaders and stuff there, they shot through to Russia. And they set up government in Russia. And what do they call themselves in Russia? Tsars. And Tsar is simply Russian for Caesar. So, you know, and after a while, Russia gave itself the name of the Third Roman Empire. And then in the Western division, that remained in Rome from 364 to 476, and then Rome collapsed. And then it shifted to France, and then France got knocked off by Germany, and set up the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation. And what do they call themselves? Kaisers. Caesar. German for Caesar. So since then, after World War I, the Western balance of power has been centered now in the democratic nations of the West. And this is where we find ourselves today. We're part of the Western democracy's balance of power. We're in this East-West balance of power stage. And you can bet your bottom dollar that there's going to be some more shifting of power coming. It's being stirred up even as we speak. Now, the next, so we know that we're in this East-West balance of power. It's in the divided stage of the Fourth Gentile Empire. We could possibly, that's where we are right now. Possibly the next thing on the horizon could be, if you know much about the Bible, is Ezekiel 38:39, which speaks about the invasion of Israel by Russia and her allies. And this, you know, when Iran, when their finances were released 4 or 5 years ago, they set out to buy plenty of arms, and they vowed that within 25 years we're going to annihilate Israel. So we know, for instance, that in this instance here with this invasion, Iran is amongst the allies of Russia. So in this 38 verses 1 to 6, there's a guy called Gog. He's the leader of the land of Magog, and he's the prince of Rosh, Meshach, and Tubal. Gog is simply the name of a leader like king or Caesar or Pharaoh, something like that. But we know from Ezekiel and from history books that the area of Magog, Rosh, Meshach, and Tubal, that's the geographic area in Ezekiel's day, that's northern Russia. That's modern day Russia. And Magog and Tubal, that's between the Black and Caspian Seas, that's southern Russia. So this invasion is going to be spearheaded by Russia coming into Israel. It also includes, this geographic area also includes parts of Iran and Turkey. That's the Magog area. And so what we see is, we see the leader of this pack will be Russia. And we're going to see he has some more allies in there. We have, for instance, we have Persia, which is Iran today, is Iran. We have Kush, which today is Ethiopia. We have Put, which is Somalia, and we have Goma, which is Germany, and then Tagama, which is Armenia. So Russia with its allies of Iran, Ethiopia, Somalia, Germany, Armenia, this is the allied force that's going to come down from the north into Israel. And Ezekiel prophesies this. So where is the invasion going to be? It's going to be on the mountains of Israel. And we see the place of invasion is Israel, but it's specifically on the mountains of Israel. And we see here that Ezekiel, in his description in chapter 38, verse 8, he's not describing an Israel that ever existed in ancient times. But every one of these statements that we see there, it's a land brought back from the sword, it's a land gathered out of many peoples, land with mountains that have been a continual waste. All these things are descriptive of modern day Israel. You know, they've brought back the wastelands, they've been rebuilt on a massive scale. And so Israel is everything that Ezekiel described back then fits perfectly Israel today. And verse 9 of Ezekiel 38 tells us the magnitude of the invasion. It's like a storm cloud that covers the entire land of Israel. It's a massive invasion. Now, what's the purpose of the invasion with Russia and her allies of Iran and the rest of them? It's to take spoil. We don't know what the spoil is, but Ezekiel said it's to take spoil. It says cattle and goods and gold and silver. And we see that this invasion is premeditated by the Russians. It says, Ezekiel verses 11 and 12 of 38 says that they devise an evil device. And so they set out to invade Israel for the purpose of spoils. I mean, for all we know today, I mean, apparently they've found huge gas and oil reserves there. Who knows what the spoils are? It could be something completely different. Now, in this instance, they're going to come down from the north into Israel, into the mountains of Israel. And again, this is something that you and I can see in our day. And we have a couple of countries here who protest. We have Sheba and Dedan, and they're actually countries in northern Arabia today, which shows that at least some of the Arab states don't like the idea of having Russians down in the Middle East. And we have another name called Tarshish, and Tarshish with all its young lions, in keeping with Ezekiel's book, and this is Spain. It's the area of Spain. So they're the ones coming down into Israel to take spoil, and they're the ones who are protest. All they do is protest. They don't say anything else. They don't take up arms. They just protest. Now, in verses 14 to 16, we see God's reason. God's reason for this invasion. It's why does he allow it to happen? For the simple reason that he's going to be sanctified or set apart in the eyes of the nations in light of what is going to happen. What's going to happen to these guys? It's God's reason is that the nations may know me, and when I shall be sanctified in you, sanctified in Israel, or in the what takes place here. And then in verses 17 to 18 of Ezekiel 38, God moves out in judgment to destroy this massive army. It's a massive army that comes down. And how does he do it? It says in verses 19 and 20, they have earthquakes, a civil war breaking out amongst the invading soldiers. These 5 nations, they probably can't decide who's going to be in the front taking the most spoils. So what happens is civil war breaks out amongst them. And they start killing each other off. And then we also have, in verse 21, it have pestilence, blood, floods, hailstones, fire, and brimstone. So all sorts of things. The outcome is that the invading army is completely destroyed without the aid of other nations. And so therefore, God does get sanctified. God's purpose is seen as succeeding. In verse 23, God is indeed sanctified in the eyes of many people. Now, these armies are said to fall specifically on the mountains of Israel. And these mountains extend the length of the center of the country. They start up at the southern point of the valley of Jezreel, up a little town called Jenin in Galilee, and they continue south until they sort of peter out down at Beersheba in the Negev. And we see that Ezekiel 39:6 says, I'll send a fire on Magog and on them that dwell securely in the isles, and they shall know that I am Jehovah. So what we see here is God is, because of this invasion, and remember, Israel is the apple of God's eye. And because of this invasion led by Russia, not only is the Russian and Allied army destroyed in Israel, but the land of Russia itself is devastated by the raining of brimstone, and it causes destruction in the nation itself. Virtually, Russia catches fire, and it will cause Russia to cease being a political force in world affairs. So Russia will go from the eastern balance of power to a point where Russia is no more. Finished. God puts an end to them as a power nation. There's the little mountains of Israel there. Probably can't see it much on there, but anyway, I thought I'd put it there. So not only will God's name be sanctified among the Gentile nations, but it's going to be sanctified in Israel as well. Why? Because a revival occurs in Israel, and it causes many Jews to turn to the Lord. So, there's the first bit of the Jews turning to the Lord. And in verses 9 to 10, it says that it's going to take 7 years to dismantle all the military equipment left behind, and Israel are going to use it for fuel. 7 years. So for 7 years, they're going to be burning the equipment that was left behind for the purpose of using it for fuel. Something else. In verse 11, the burial place for all these dead bodies, remember, there's going to be millions there, and they're all going to be killed on the mountains of Israel. In one of the valleys east of the Mediterranean, that's where they're going to bury them. And it's going to put it in the Jordan Valley above the Dead Sea. And it's going to be renamed. It's going to rename a special town for those people who have got 7 months of full-time work finding bodies and burying them. It's going to take 7 months to complete burying all the bodies and pieces of bodies, because remember, with the fighting and the hailstone and all these things, they're going to be bits and pieces everywhere, and all the crags and rocks in the mountains. So they're going to have quite a time fishing them out and then finding them and burying them. 7 months is going to take them to bury them. Now, some basic observations regarding this. The invasion takes place, first of all, when Israel is a state again. When did that happen? 1948. 1948, Israel became a state. So that criteria is fixed. It's also when the waste places of past centuries are again inhabited. Same thing. Israel back in the land, all those waste places are now inhabited. In fact, they're building more and more cities. They're re-establishing the old cities again. And thirdly, when Israel is dwelling in unwalled villages, what does that mean? That's actually a very good present-day description of the kibbutzim. The kibbutzim are communities where the Israelis live and they work, and they don't have walls around their villages because they're quite confident in their ability to protect themselves. And fourthly, it says when Israel is dwelling securely. So it means that Israel is living in security, which means confidence. So what it is Israel are very confident in their abilities to protect themselves, whether it is a state of war or peace. They're very confident in their ability to look after themselves. After all, they've been fighting for a very long time. For a very small nation, they've been fighting for a very long time. So all of those things are fulfilled today. So today, Israel is just sitting there, and they know that there will come a time when this invasion prophesied by Ezekiel will come to pass. And so they're just sitting there waiting. Now, we say here that this must happen before the tribulation. This Russian invasion must happen before the tribulation. Why? Because from the text of Ezekiel 38, 1 to 39, 16, Israel is established before the tribulation and she's dwelling securely. Secondly, the Russian Confederacy invades Israel during this time of security before the tribulation. And thirdly, the confederacy is destroyed in Israel before the tribulation. Why do we say that? Well, first of all, this pre-trib view best answers the question of the 7 months of burial and the 7 years of burning. The pre-trib view is the only view that has no problems with either the 7 months or the 7 years. The Jews continue to dwell in the land after this invasion, and they remain there until the middle of the tribulation. So the 7 months of burial is not a problem, because you got to remember that in the midpoint of the tribulation, the Jews are fleeing out of the land, because that's when the Antichrist turns against them. So they're escaping from the land. So there's no time for burying or for burning for 7 years then, because they're simply escaping. In fact, rather than burning the weapons, they'll be using the weapons to defend themselves. So the pre-trib view is the best view, simply because another thing is that the 7 years also create no problem, since they would begin before the tribulation, begin burning, and they can extend burning as far as the midpoint of the tribulation. And so we can cover that 7-year period. And according to the pre-trib view, this invasion must take place at least 3.5 years or more before the tribulation begins. Why? Because at the 3.5-year point in the tribulation, the mid-tribulation, the Jews are fleeing out of the land. So they would need to be finished burning by then, and need to be finished burying by then. So it has to, the latest it can happen is 3.5 years before the tribulation. So it fits well with the 7 years of burning. Now, imagine that this invasion takes place from Russia into Israel. Russia as a nation is finished. The east-west balance of power is now collapsed. And according to Daniel 7, verse 23, he speaks about, thus he said, the fourth beast shall be a fourth kingdom upon earth, which shall be diverse from all the kingdoms, and shall devour the whole earth, and shall tread it down and break it in pieces. And as for the 10 horns, out of this kingdom shall 10 kings arise, and another shall arise after them, and he shall be diverse from the former, and he's going to put down 3 kings. Put down sounds like you're putting down a sick animal. Now, so at some point in the not too distant future, the east-west balance of power will break down, and it will lead to a one-world government. So that could be one scenario for this one-world government. Who knows what's being touted now in the back rooms regarding, keeping the world safe from disease and all these things. So, but looking at this, we see this breakdown of the east-west balance of power will lead to a one-world government system. And this stage is seen by Daniel 7, but not by Daniel 2. Daniel 7, verse 23, clearly states that at some point, the fourth empire will devour the whole world. Now, this is something that Rome never did. In the case of the fourth empire, the wording here states that it will devour the whole earth. And the text demands that the fourth empire will at some time control the whole world and will devour it. When you're speaking about devouring it and breaking it in pieces, it's not something to look forward to. So if literal interpretation is maintained, then the fourth empire of imperialism is yet to control the whole world in the formation of a one world government, which is something that has not yet been accomplished. It's still coming. And for this reason, Rome must not be seen as the totality of the fourth empire, but Rome should be seen as only the first stage of the empire of imperialism, with the second stage the east-west balance of power, where we are today. Third stage, after the east-west balance of power collapses, or whatever reason, it's just no longer there, this third stage will be a one world government stage. And that will happen at some point when this east-west stage collapses. And in light of Ezekiel 38 to 39, the eastern balance of power, which is Russia and her allies, will collapse with the fall of the Russian forces and her allies in Israel, and with the destruction of Russia itself. So with the eastern power destroyed, there now becomes a way for a one world government to be opened up. Now, Daniel chapter 7:24, he speaks about 10 horns. And it says, as for the 10 horns, this is the fourth beast, out of this kingdom shall 10 kings arise. So these 10 horns are 10 kingdoms. Whenever you see horns in the Bible, in the context, it's speaking about powers or kings or kingdoms. So what we see here is that there's going to be, out of this one world system, and this one world government system, which is not too distant future, at some time that's going to split into 10 kingdoms and 10 kings. And they will then rule the entire world through these 10 kingdoms, 10 divisions. Now, this stage was seen in both Daniel chapter 2 and Daniel chapter 7, because in Daniel chapter 2 we had the 10 toes, and in Daniel chapter 7 we have the 10 horns. So the 10 division stage is clearly stated to come out of the one world government stage. Now, for some reason, we don't know why, the one world government will divide into these 10 kingdoms. The Daniel passage here states that once the fourth empire rules the whole world, then this one world government will split into 10 kingdoms. Okay. And Daniel 7:24 goes on to write about another horn, a little horn. Daniel 7 verse 24. And another shall arise after them, and he shall be diverse from the former, and he shall put down 3 kings. So it is during this 10 kingdom stage. So we have the east-west balance of power where we are today. This collapses. We go into a one world government stage that then separates into 10 kingdoms around the world. And then this 11th horn, a little horn, rises up. He rises up and he begins, the Antichrist begins to rise to power. And eventually he's going to be strong enough to uproot or to kill 3 of those 10 kings. He's going to kill 3 of the 10 kings, and the other 7 will simply say, mate, it's all yours. Leave us alive, it's all yours. They'll submit to his authority. Now, once the other 7 submit their authority to the Antichrist, this is now going to begin the 5th and final stage of the 4th Gentile empire. And this is the Antichrist stage. And this is the stage of absolute imperialism. There will never, ever have been a dictator or a tyrant like the Antichrist. He is going to be diverse from the other 10 world rulers, and he's going to be diverse of everything that went before him. Now, there was to be a revelation of the identity of the Antichrist before the tribulation. Is clear from a passage in 2 Thessalonians 2 verses 1 to 3. Paul is writing to the Thessalonian church, and he says, now we beseech you, brethren, touching the coming of the Lord Jesus Christ, and are gathering together unto him. He's just writing to them, and he says, listen, let no man beguile you in any wise, for it will not be except the falling away come first, and then the man of sin be revealed, the son of perdition. So 2 events happen before the day of the Lord or before the tribulation. 2 events. First is the falling away, That's the apostasy of the church that began back in the 1900s, and it's visible today in the church. The other thing is the revealing of the man of sin, the son of perdition. There's going to be a revelation of the Antichrist that precedes the tribulation, and it will be for the believers at that time. Yeah, the rapture may or may not have occurred by then, since the scriptures don't tell us exactly how long before the tribulation and rapture happens. The Antichrist rise to power before the tribulation is a biblical necessity. He has to rise to power before the tribulation. Why? Because he has to be in a sufficiently powerful position so that he can sign a 7-year covenant or a 7-year peace treaty with the nation of Israel. So he needs to be in sufficient political power to do that. Another event leading up to the tribulation, we see in 1 Thessalonians 5:1-3. He's talking about the times and seasons. You know, he's writing to them. He says, listen, he says, you know perfectly well that the day of the Lord comes as a thief in the night. He says, when they're saying peace and safety, when people are saying, oh, it's just a marvelous time, we're having such a marvelous world, it's such a marvelous place, it's just peace and safety everywhere. And once they say that, once they're with that, it says sudden destruction comes upon them. So everything will be going along nice and honky-dory, and all of a sudden, bang, tribulation hits. So day of the Lord is the most common term for the tribulation. So at the time when they're saying peace and safety, the destruction of the tribulation hits them with devastating force. And this fact will require this period to come just before the act that initiates the tribulation itself. So while all the world is under the 10 kingdoms and the Antichrist is rising to power, there's going to be a period of peace and false security. Everybody will be happy, happy, happy. But this will be shattered by the tribulation. And then we're going to see now what starts the tribulation. We see this in Daniel chapter 9, verse 27, and Isaiah chapter 28, verses 14-22. It's not the rapture that starts the tribulation, right? It's the signing of a 7-year covenant. And the relationship of the Antichrist to the start of the tribulation, we see in Daniel chapter 9, verse 27. Daniel writes, his book is about how the Jews are going to live in the times of the Gentiles. He writes about Israel living under the rule of Gentile domination. And so he's writing here in Daniel chapter 9, verse 27. And he's talking about this guy. He shall make a firm covenant with many for 1 week. In the middle of the week, he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. And upon the wing of abomination shall come one that makes desolate, and even unto the full end, that determined shall wrath be poured out upon the desolate. Lots of desolates and desolations here. This verse is part of the famous 70-week prophecy found in Daniel chapter 9. And the entire context of this prophecy begins in 9 verse 24 and through to 9:27. According to Daniel 9:24, the prophecy states that a period of 490 years has been decreed over the people of Israel for the purpose of bringing to completion all history and prophecy. And during the first 69 sevens, or 483 years, Jerusalem is going to be rebuilt, and Israel are going to experience troublesome times. At the end of the 69th seven, at the end of 483 years, there is a gap of time. A gap suddenly enters the picture, and now we have a gap of time between the 69th seven and the 70th seven week. 3 things are going to happen in this gap of time. So the gap of time of 483 years is already passed. First thing that's going to happen is Messiah will be killed. He was killed in AD 30. Second, Jerusalem and the temple will be destroyed, happened in AD 70. and we're going to have a long period of desolation to follow against the Jewish people. Well, what happened? It happened, it began to change only when Israel became a nation in 1948. But there's one more week to run, and that is the last 7 years, and that is the 7 years of the Great Tribulation. And verse 27 it gives us the single event that's going to start the clock ticking away. And that's when the Antichrist signs a covenant, a 7-year covenant between himself and Israel. And so one way the Antichrist is going to be identified is he'll be the guy who will sign that peace treaty between himself and Israel. That's just a bit of a summary there of the events leading up to the tribulation. We didn't bother tonight to deal with the historic stuff, but we're mainly looking at what's coming ahead of us. And coming ahead of us, we're going to have the Allied invasion of Israel. We're going to have the one world government. We're going to have the 10 kingdoms. We're going to have the rise of the Antichrist. Well, hopefully we're not around then. And then we're going to have this period of peace and false security. And then we're going to have the signing of the 7-year covenant. Okay. Now, during this period of time, during the period, including the last stage of the church age, as well as the tribulation, the scriptures speak of 5 blackouts that will occur. What's a blackout? It simply means that the light of the sun, the moon, and the stars are suddenly blacked out, so the earth is not receiving any light from these sources whatsoever. No part of the earth will be receiving any light from these heavenly sources. And it's going to be similar to the blackout that was back in Egypt in one of those 10 plagues. And we see that in Exodus chapter 10, verses 21 to 23, Exodus 10, 21 to 23. And also, there was another blackout that happened at the crucifixion. And that's in Matthew 27, verse 45. Now, the first of these 5 blackouts is clearly prophesied to occur before the tribulation. Who tells us this? A prophet called Joel. In Joel chapter 2, verse 31, Joel says this. He says, "The sun shall be turned into darkness and the moon into blood before the great and terrible day of Jehovah comes." Remember, day of Jehovah is another term for the Great Tribulation. It's always a name for the tribulation. So the first worldwide blackout is to take place beforehand. So at some point before the tribulation, one of these worldwide blackouts will occur. And man, can you imagine the climate change, people, when that happens? Now, tribulation temple is mentioned in 4 passages. The tribulation temple has to be rebuilt. A temple has to be rebuilt to function in the first half of, in the period of the tribulation. 4 passages of scripture mention this. We see Daniel chapter 9:27, because in Daniel 9:27 he talks about the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. That's the Jewish sacrificial system is going to stop. So it means the temple has to be around. In Matthew 24:15, Jesus speaking, he says, "When you see the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place is in the inside of the temple. The temple must be around." And 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 3 to 4, that speaks about, again, the Antichrist. It says that he sits in the temple of God, setting himself forth as God. So obviously, with the Antichrist, he has to sit in the temple, so the temple has to be up and functioning by the time he takes over. And the 4th passage is Revelation chapter 11, verses 1 to 2, and it simply speaks about John measuring the temple of God. So there's obviously a temple there to be measured. Okay. Now, the point to be noted is that by the time of the middle of the tribulation temple is standing and it's functioning for at least for a little while before the midpoint of the tribulation. So this means that the temple, the tribulation temple, must be rebuilt sometime before the middle of the tribulation. And this allows for only two options. It's either rebuilt either before the tribulation or during the first half of the tribulation. Don't know which one, but we do know that by the midpoint of the tribulation, it must be running. It must be up and functioning for a while. Now, once the temple is rebuilt, what's going to happen? The Jewish people are going to reintroduce the Mosaic sacrificial system. But unfortunately for them, this is a temple that, according to Isaiah 66, verses 1 to 6, Isaiah 66, verses 1 to 6, this is a temple that God will not accept. He will have nothing to do with this temple. He will not sanction this temple whatsoever. What God is looking for at this time is not animal sacrifices. He's looking for faith in Messiah Jesus. And in fact, the sacrifices that they'll be offering will not be accepted by God. And we see this in Isaiah 66, verse 3. He says it's like breaking a dog's neck or killing a swine offering sacrifices. And in verse 4 of Isaiah 66, because they're doing this, it shows that there's a failure to listen to God's word. Because if they listen to God's word, they know that there's no requirement for a sacrificial system for their sins anymore, because Jesus did all that. And we also see in Isaiah 66 that not everybody will be buying into this thing, because what we see there is that God will be encouraging the remnant of that day who says, why is this happening? You know, we're not into this. So he'd be encouraging them. So what we know is that this temple will only end in judgment. Now, the Bible has 4 temples. We have Solomon's temple. That was the very first temple, and God sanctioned that. And when that got burnt down, Zerubbabel rebuilt it in a much smaller version, and that temple was the one where Herod, renovated it. And that's the temple where Jesus turned up at. So that's sanctioned by God. And we know that the temple in the millennial kingdom is the one that Messiah himself will build, and that will certainly be sanctioned by God. So the only temple that's not going to be sanctioned by God is the temple that the Jews are trying to find a way to build today. And that's not, God is not going to sanction that temple at all. This new temple is only going to end in judgment and not in forgiveness of sin or any acceptable worship. Now, just briefly here, the 6-Day War in 1967, it set the stage for the temple to be rebuilt. Why? Because up until 1967, from 1948 to 1967, the temple compound was under Arab control. But during the 6-Day War, the temple area was taken back by Jewish control. Another thing here quickly is that the only tribe today which can identify itself is the tribe of Levi. And the tribe of Levi is the only tribe that can serve in the temple. And hello, they're the only ones today who can identify themselves, because their records, they are known simply by their names. People who are called Cohen or Levine, Leventhal, Levi, they're all from the Levi, the tribe of Levi. And they're actually preparing themselves even now to reinstitute the worship and the service in this temple. So that, my friends, is your lot for this week. So what we're looking for now, we're currently in this east-west balance of power, Western democracies, Eastern Bloc of countries, and that is going to collapse somehow, and there's going to become a one world government system. We're also, we think it's going to collapse because of the invasion of Israel, which can happen anytime. So what we're looking forward to is the invasion of Israel, the collapse of the east-west balance of power, the one world government system being set up, and then that one world government system then splits into 10 kingdoms, and then we're going to have the rising of the Antichrist. He will kill 3 of those 10 world rulers, and then he will take absolute authority. And he'll be the one who starts the clock ticking on the tribulation by signing that 7-year peace covenant, peace treaty with Israel.